All right. Well, I'm Lorna Meyer, and for those who don't know me, I'm the current president of the San Francisco Advocacy for um, the National Museum of Women for the Arts, NMWA, in Washington, D.C. I want to welcome everyone today and let you know that Susan Fisher Sterling is joined us she's the director of NMWA. And Susan, if you're here, welcome. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our secretary of our group, Robin Laub, who also is on our board of directors and has organized this event with Francis. So thank you, Robin, and we'll take it away.
Today we have an exciting program created and presented to you by artist, gallerist, and my dear friend, Francis Mill. Before I share many of his wonderful attributes in my introduction, I'd like to give you an overview of what the program will be like in the next hour. Francis will speak for about 40 minutes, and then after Francis concludes his talk, we will have remaining time for a Q&A. Please send a question in the chat line or just raise your hand and Francis can respond. Jamie Austin, Director of Exhibitions and Public Programming at the California College of the Arts, will assist in moderating as well as navigating the Q&A. When I first asked Francis if he'd like to speak to our group, the San Francisco Advocacy for the National Museum of Women in the Arts, he said, "Oh, Robin, I would love to dazzle you and the whole NMWA audience." So Francis has been working hard at approaching his presentation in a unique way that bridges his journey as Joan's student to key moments in her works that have revealed itself over 20 plus years of looking. Joan Brown is one of the 3 influential teachers in his life. If you recall from the oil on canvas of Joan Brown's nude in chair number 2 piece that was on the invitation, that was a painting that Francis sold many years ago. He has also recommended it to be included in Joan's upcoming retrospective at SFNMWA. Now a little bit about Francis Mill. Francis Mill is an artist and is currently working on an architectural installation to be unveiled in the coming year. He attended the University of California, Berkeley, with an undergraduate degree in architecture from 1985 to 1989, and an undergraduate and graduate degrees in fine art painting from 1989 to 1991. He studied under Joan Brown during the years from 1985 to 1989. Francis was a professor in academia for 10 years. At the age of 24, he began teaching drawing at the University of San Francisco and printmaking at the Academy of Art in San Francisco. While continuing his teaching, he also became the school's Dean of Graduate Studies from 1995 to the year 2000. During this time, he also wrote for the New York Arts Magazine and was an art critic for the San Francisco Examiner. And his first article was a review on an expansive exhibition on digital technology at SFNMWA. For the next 20 years, he continued his path as teacher, lecturer, curator, and builder of private art collections as director of Hackett Friedman Gallery in San Francisco. And for the last 10 years, as the co-owner of Hackett Mill Gallery. Wow. With all that, I'd like you all to meet Francis Mill. Thanks, Francis.
Thank you, Robin. Welcome, everyone. And I like to say that in preparation for today, I did learn that I probably have about 10 different presentations on Joan Brown on a myriad of topics. And but today I had to settle on one, and I tried my best to select all the important thoughts and insights that I have that I feel could inspire, and I hope that it could bring some new information and insights into her works for everyone. But in following in Joan's footsteps, I would say we have a lot of work to cover, and I'm just going to dive in and get started. I actually never saw Joan's work solely from a Western perspective. That never-ending debate between East and West Coasts didn't seem to preoccupy Joan's reality. it was much more of an interest in the dialogue between, I feel, the West and the Far East. Joan embraced it all. She looked wide and broad, and she was incredibly resourceful in finding materials far and wide to fuel her ideas and her art, whether it be modern masters of the West or ancient civilizations of China and India, Mexico, or Peru, for example. I feel Joan's sensibilities and overall awareness had connection to what I actually saw and was exposed to as a child, to Asian art and learning Chinese painting and calligraphy from my father. And it was not so much about a search for style, rather than more of a search for a personal maturity and being one with your chosen medium of expression. And I believe her awareness of Eastern aesthetic and her personal spiritual journey, her search for enlightenment, called on Joan to constantly push the conventions of painting. And I see that actually throughout her body of work. In fact, even as early as the 1960s, even before her major travels abroad in the later 70s. So I will go as far as to say, I feel her importance to the Bay Area figurative movement was not merely that she was the only female artist in the group, but that it was her voice, her contribution that directly expanded the vocabulary of the movement. I feel Joan really didn't need a movement to actually validate her work. She stood solidly on her own. Although she eschewed categories and labels, I say she was in a category by herself. And there lies the problem with labels and categories, which more times than not provide a false clarity of sameness without revealing differences. And there was no question to me that Joan was unique. I was a student of Joan's in 1985 to 89. And as a freshman at Berkeley, filled with insecurities, I was a young teenager, hiding my own dyslexia, majoring in architecture, having studied my father's art since I was 4. And by my teen years, I was trying to escape it because I thought it was too old-fashioned. First year in college, reading the French philosopher Gaston Bachelard, Poetics of Space, and it didn't understand a single word in it. I found myself in a art class, painting class with Professor Robert Hartman, and I happened to be painting a tree. And he came around and asked, well, what are you painting? I said, a tree. And he said, well, it doesn't feel like a tree. And how embarrassing it was. For the next session, he brought in a book of trees so I could see what it looked like. And so you could see I had not at that time cornered the market on self-confidence, and my self-image was sort of severely battered. And what I had a lot of was fear. And Professor Hartman said, you should take a class from Joan. So I did. And over time, I found that discomfort with fear actually to be quite useful, because fear is a feeling. And when I was able to embrace it, that's where I began my journey of starting to build my confidence and my own identity. And I found Joan hardly ever talked actually about her works, but yet I felt everything that she said provided insights into her art. Her words were not necessarily answers for a young artist who may have a lot of questions at that time, because Joan wasn't a formulaic kind of person, kind of teacher. And so her words were more words that made you think and taught you how to see. And so today, what I've done is woven together a visual journey of insights I've made into Joan's work, but through a Far East lens rather than a Western lens. And I feel important to sometimes change or challenge our presumed points of view in order to see something familiar in a new way. And Joan definitely did that in her own way of seeing. I will forego a linear chronology because I believe we don't file memories in a linear manner. And today is all about looking and all about feeling. Joan was the first to say to me that you can do both art and architecture. And why not was really her position. And I couldn't really think of a good enough reason why not. So I immediately set up a dynamic of opposing forces in myself, and it creates this internal battle, tension, if you will. And you have to learn to fight to resolve that over time. And I learned actually to enjoy that tension. I came to understand that how you respond and resolve these tensions is where your artistic voice can come out. And I often find myself looking for evidence of those battles in other artists, seeing how they handled it, how they responded. And that was thrilling and inspiring for me. And in the 1950s, there were certainly a lot of battles going on, whether it be the East-West Coast debate or abstraction versus figuration. But one thing was for certain, all the artists had to reckon with that picture plane. What do you do within that frame? And so I want to start now looking at what was happening around Joan during this time. And of course, the New York school cast a big shadow, abstract expressionism, but I felt Joan was less concerned about escaping those shadows, more concerned about what she could look and adopt there, really to feel her own work. And so we're looking here at a Willem de Kooning painting from 1950 titled Excavation. I certainly see this as a watershed moment of abstract expressionism where the battle going on was happening on the surface. It was a picture plane redefined, not as a window, as a threshold, but an all-around field that was flat on a vertical plane, and the event taking place right on the surface itself. These were not preconceived compositions, but more finding mature passages through investigation of paint and other materials. And in this case, subtracting, thus the title, Excavation, was just as vital and important as a gesture as the addition of pigment onto the surface. And Joan too was in that battle during this time. This is a painting from 1957, quite the clash of forces here. When I see this painting, there's an obvious tug of war between this reference to landscape, sky and ground, and versus the suspended world of suggestions that is so Joan, looking at this sort of claw-like form in red in the lower left quadrant that can almost be a winged bird creature that she many times would have made in the late 50s in the early period. But I do take note in this painting, and the significant point that I wanted to share with you is that even in this early period of 1957, just a clear sign of a fearless painter in Joan. She attacked this picture plane with broad range of markings that she basically had to resolve. Passages were never predictable, not repetitive, from the range of brush gauge to the very broad and wide along here. I'll use my cursor along the right portion of this painting to the more lyrical and calligraphic spontaneous gestures that happen in the lower left region. The areas of dry brush that I'm following here with the pointer over existing paint to also areas of wet into wet where she's pushing, and quite a lot in the blue region where the stroke comes across here where it just pushes these other areas of the blue that was still wet, and it creates a raised edge here. So there was quite a lot of spontaneity and problem solving and improv happening in the course of this painting. And so even at this early stage, you can see that Joan was not a timid painter. We take a look at David Park, a gouache from 1960, and the battle he was taking on in the late 50s I find it to be really that battle for that fluidity with the brushwork and being one with the paint. And I really see this late 50s into the 1960s work as exemplifying meeting of improv inspired from jazz as he was a musician and paint. You see here Richard Diebenkorn, for example, and I believe his figurative works in the mid to late 50s into the early 60s provided a way to see for him the underlying structure of the picture plane that basically led to the architecture of his ocean parks that came after. And here is an example, almost 20 years after the figurative head that I just showed you. He did about 13 of these ocean park images on cigar box lids. And if you look at this side by side, these are two that I have put together in my mind quite often to see the architectural relationship. And Manuel Neri pushing basic materials, in this case, plaster and paint beyond familiar forms. You could view it as a resolution between painting and sculpture. With Neri, by adding color onto key passages of this plaster, paint stopping before the surface dramatically changes direction, for example. By doing so, he accentuates a line. So in this way, I feel that Neri was really bringing a resolution to the tensions between three entities, which is painting, sculpture, and drawing. Then we arrive at Joan, and this is a portrait of Charlie Watts, the drummer of the Rolling Stone. And she brought her own physicality to painting. She literally pushed paint to its outer limits. Think of the challenge of handling this quantity of weight and the gravity. As a painter myself, I could say, you know, when you handle that much paint, you have to tend with the physicality of it in a very different way. It takes its own form and life beyond what you're trying to represent and depict. In here, I want to look at Joan in the context of her contemporaries, her painting on the left, along with a painted plaster by Neri, and a David Park on the far right. And I myself at that time studying with Joan, I have to say, I don't think I saw what paint was until I saw this painting. At least had not seen how paint behaved as it dried over time at this level of density. And I feel impasto is the understatement here. It's almost an alchemist at work, changing the properties of the material. How provocative it is for Joan to actually intrude, I feel, to the physical space of the viewer, so much that you cannot stand idly by. You have to tilt and turn to see the materiality of the paint unfold in real time. However, for Joan, I don't feel her contribution stops here with impasto. I see much more happening in this period. And so I want to dive a bit deeper into the architecture of Joan Brown. This painting, titled Noel on a Pony with Cloud from 1963, is based on a photograph. And in the photograph, you could see clearly Noel, her son, seated on the pony on the left, and then another pony in a short distance away on the right. And I find it interesting over the years as I studied this painting that pony sort of metamorphosized, the other one on the right in the distance, metamorphosized into this looming yellow silhouette that's raised up on a higher level, not where it was in the original photograph. And as I study this painting over the years, I get the sense that really her treatment of space was quite unique during this period. I find her treatment of space was very ethereal. When there is the absence of the horizon line and when she escaped the tangible world of modeling light and dark, Joan embraced this dreamlike space and that I feel transcends the conventional boundaries between real time, memory, and place. And it almost suggests two very distinct times and places in this painting, with the division along the diagonal here through the center. And this second pony is less rendered in detail than the first in real time. And it almost suggests this sort of vision, memory, or a dreamlike vision. And I think also significant, as referenced in the title, the presence of the cloud, the blue cloud behind Noel, again, as another symbol of sort of the dream state or otherworldly. And as I go through the archives images in my mind, I can't help but pull the image of the Paul Gauguin, the vision of the sermon after the sermon, painted in Brittany, the depicted Breton women after the sermon had this vision, biblical vision of Jacob and an angel wrestling. And this was clearly a vision, a dream. It was not happening in the real space that the women occupies. And so in this case, compositionally, the tree takes on this role of creating two very distinct spaces that crosses time and reality. And I see this architecture in quite a number of Joan's paintings from this period. And we'll take a look at that. Look at this painting, highly abstracted, but the Cocker Spaniel with, again, the presence of the cloud, setting up two very distinct spaces, two very distinct times, a suggestion of memory. And we see it again in this seemingly straightforward girl in a chair. But again, the presence of this sort of looming cloud-like form, symbolic again of this dream state. In this painting, all ground and reference to a representational space is basically suspended. Even though the title references the girl is in a body of water, I see this figure sort of emerging from this very ethereal space. And the only anchor is really the vertical element of the pole, of the green pole. And I can't help but start reading that, you know, that there's a sequence of time here where that is a demarcation of another time of perhaps the future, where the figure would emerge into. And I feel that linear demarcation metamorphosizes again in a later painting. In this case, it becomes a framed work on a wall above a mantle. And again, you have, per the title, the memory of after the Alcatraz swim in 1975, and you have Joan situated in real-time space and with another vision or memory in this case within the single picture plane. So again, you have that a duality of time and space. And this one really fascinates me. Again, you see the same dynamic of the duality of time and space. But I find very fascinating that what's depicted, what she had copied onto the wall is a painting by a 11th century Chinese painter from the Northern Song Dynasty. And I'm going to pronounce his name properly in the Cantonese because I want you to hear the authentic sounds, because usually the English is translated phonetically from Mandarin. And I have to say, by that time, it's so butchered down that it sounds really bizarre to my ears. But the name of this artist is Lei Gonglan, and born in 1049 AD. And interesting to note this because he was known to paint horses, a painter of horses. He was a highly respected civil servant in the government, highly respected as a painter, and he adopted a very expressive mode, abbreviated expressive mode of painting, and versus the more illustrative detail, for example. And he painted often also Buddhist themes. So I am very convinced, and I know that Joan had a vast collection of books in her library of topics of many other cultures around the world. So I find it very meaningful that this is the image that she decides to include. It's almost many of what this artist represents, what, 800, almost 1,000 years apart to today, parallels a lot of, I feel, Joan's sensibilities. And so I find Joan to be quite studied in her knowledge of art and from around the world. And on this note, I want to introduce another important Chinese painter that I actually brought into the classroom back in the late 80s and had a couple of conversations with Joan and other people at that time. And I'll pronounce it again in the proper Cantonese. This is Chai Bak-sak. He is an important 20th century painter that quite influential also for my father's work. So I was exposed to this artist's work from an early age. He too was very known for his whimsy and expressiveness and with abbreviated marks and rather having illustrative detail. He was more about painting a feeling and having that oneness with brush. But I show this one, I happen to have photographed this one in in my travels in 2018. There happened to be a show of this artist's work at the National Museum in Tokyo, and this was photographed from there. And I'm bringing it to your attention because if you look at this work, there is no such thing as negative space in Chinese painting. It was something. It had weight and physical presence. It takes over the entire picture plane here, and it represents water as the fishes are above and below. And so the definition and the view of the void in the Far East has a little bit of much of a different significance than here in the West. And Joan always said in my times with her, never neglect any area of the picture, and especially not around the subject or in between the subject. And I feel that the concept of positive and negative spaces sets up a hierarchical order that doesn't really work in the architecture of Joan. The areas around in between is so vital for Joan. As we had just seen, it's in those areas that she can transport herself into these like dreamlike spaces. And these in-between spaces were so vital that in this painting, she basically made it the main subject. Or at least it is the in-between space here is occupying the majority of the picture plane, where traditionally the main subject or event would occupy, for example. And while on the topic of these in-between spaces, this was also a topic of discussion many times, is Giorgio Morandi, the Italian painter, came up many times with Joan in her critiques and studio chatter. And at the time of speaking about Morandi's work, I had not seen these in person. And subsequently, decades later, I had the opportunity to be in Milan and took the train to Bologna only to see one thing, is at the Morandi Museum. And this is the painting that I had only seen, the one on the left, had only seen in books. And I'll try to describe to you as best as I can because it doesn't come through in the digital. But this painting is so dense and dark, if you will, and up close, all the individual mark makings with the brush in the in-between spaces between the bottles and the vessels were just as invigorating to see and experience as the objects themselves. So there was this huge, great attention and integrity of mark makings in the in-between spaces, as well as the object and the subject themselves. And in the etching, for example, of course, it's cross-hatching lines and layers. And I'll mimic it for you with my hands, but in between the picture, you have another object behind that's quite darker. But in reality, when you see this one in person, all the lines in that in-between spaces are all clear, and you see every layer of line over the next layer. And it is thrilling to see. And that's how he was able to obtain these sort of dark passages of shadow, for example. It's built up in the same way as the objects are, and just incredibly thrilling to see as an artist. And on the subject of line, we go to my second introduction of work by Chai Bak-sak. And in this painting, line is in Asian culture and Chinese painting, line is analyzed and talked about endlessly, even, I would say, even more sometimes than the image or subject itself. Because the line, the single line, reveals all the strengths, vulnerabilities, the artist's spontaneity in problem solving. It represents also, it shows the years of practice and the maturity of the artist. So all that really makes an authentic felt line. And if that is achieved, sometimes it takes a lifetime, no one could really make that same line. So the line itself completely references the artist, the presence of the artist, the self. And that brings me to the next topic on Joan is self-portraiture. But I would like to expand that a bit to say the presence of the artist, actually. Because if you look at the inscription here, and I will translate, of course, on the lower left is the signature of the artist, Chai Bak-sak. But the full translation, if you add the few characters below, in the whole inscription, is that Chai Bak-sak painted or created this. And that's something that I have had seen quite a bit with my father and in Chinese painting. It was the highlighting of the act of creating. It wasn't just a signature. It was claiming ownership to the action. And I have to say, in Asian cultures, the action of making a mark, a line, was of great importance, even perhaps even sacred. And the act of creating art was less about a career rather than more of a calling. And so again, it's seeing the self positioned in the larger universe. It was about attaining this maturity that is all-seeing. And so here again, we continue with the presence of the artist. And the presence of the artist can appear in a multitude of ways. One, of course, being the making of a line. And Joan commented on line consistently. If I was doing good, if we were making good marks, she'd say that's a good line. She'd say that quite a bit. And for Joan, she would always nudge me and say, bring in that line, finish your composition to the edge. You kind of see that what she's doing here. Don't neglect the outer areas of the edge. She'd say, don't forget to get to the edges. So this one summarizes very much of many comments that she will make online. And this one was recently exhibited, included in the David Park retrospective, where it was on view at the SFNMWA. And here's an up close of that line. And this is how, you know, and anyone who perhaps studied with Joan and perhaps, think about how you would really describe her line. Using this as an example, knowing her and remembering all that she says, I describe Joan's line as a searching line, a looking for something. There's a feeling of a raw, I would say actually raw agitation, sort of a nervous excitement, if you will, leading into whimsy and humor and some satire, and closing with just sheer willpower. That's how I describe her line. Another way a line appears is by subtraction. And here in this collage painting, I'll follow with my pointer here, that this cloud-like form again appears. And these are pieces of paper collaged. And by subtraction, she's created this line here that, for me, again, is very synonymous with the description that I just shared with you about the line made with ink, for example. And this work, you see her pictured in front of it, brings us to another way that the presence of the artist is made known, and that is on the monumental scale, confronting your own image in a monumental way, a scale, size. It's jolting and jarring and provocative, and I feel in a way it was purposeful in a very assertive way for definitely a young artist in the late 50s and early 60s. I would even say perhaps purposeful as for Joan, in a very male-dominated era. It was a very bold way to present yourself from scale, and she always pushed us to work larger, get out of our comfort zone. We look here again at the presence of the artist, with just again emphasis on weight and mass, and also the gaze. And as I mine the archives in my head of references, with this painting, I think quite a bit of this work by Willem de Kooning from 1944 at the Metropolitan Museum. I know that Joan was very inspired by de Kooning's women's series in the 1960s, but it's this one that I find quite the affinity if you look at them side by side. These two works, I mean, in terms of weight and mass, in the de Kooning with those biomorphic shapes piled up, you do sense this gravitational pull. There's no modeling of 3 dimensions here. Everything is really pretty flat, but you do have the sense of gravity and weight. And again, noticing the gaze in both. That's very direct, and that's something that I'll bring up a little bit later towards the end too. Another way that the presence of the artist is known is basically in the presence of is the ordinary subject, for example, the everyday activity, which we'll see in the next image. In the Asian aesthetic, there was quite the importance in everyday activity or objects. Recording the everyday was humbling. It was memorializing, documenting the self in existence in the universe. It was rather symbolic of longevity. And of course, for Joan, the recording of an observation or a memory, for me, what it does for an artist is it allows you to take ownership of something less tangible, the feelings associated with a moment. In this case, after the Alcatraz swim in 1976, it's a way to process, I feel, how one saw themselves perhaps in the larger context of the world. Another reference to the presence of the self, and specifically to Joan, is really the presence of Joan's humor, her tongue-in-cheek, a bit of satire, her making fun or making light of things. Every time since the first time I seen this painting, I never felt that there were just 2 paintings represented here. The about to be finished one on the easel, one leaning behind her that seems to be finished. And there's a third painting that's a full-blown abstract expressionist painting on the floor that she's actually stepping on. So I cannot see this one without mentioning Joan's humor and tongue in cheek, and she's having fun with it. This painting, for me, represents a full embrace of really the most broad spectrum, from the ordinary. Here she's depicting herself from a photograph of Joan as a little girl, and from the ordinary to the mythical, to the otherworldly, represented by the dragon. Again, the individual versus the forces greater in the world, the intangible versus the tangible, the physical earthly with the ethereal heavenly, if you will. And it was clear that Joan was fascinated with the Chinese culture, and the dragon being very symbolic. This was taken from a image from one of her books. I feel noteworthy that the image that she copied this dragon from actually did not have the Chinese characters on there. And so we know that it brings to mind, the embrace of Asian iconography from another painter, for example, the Van Gogh here in 1887, where he was so influenced by Japanese prints, and the calligraphy, by the way, is Chinese, actually. I'm sure my father would have a comment and critique of Van Gogh's calligraphy here, but interesting. I've seen this image in my father's book very early on, and drew a connection with Joan, but also very distinct with Joan, though. I feel that with Joan, she was really not necessarily, it was a novelty for her. It was more of, she was building her own self-image. She was adopting an architecture here, and how she sees herself. And before we move on from here, I just want to quickly make a reference, because another point of, I think, evidence of how studied she was. I don't believe, actually, and I'll let everyone else decide. I'm not quite sure if she just sort of borrowed the calligraphy, the characters, from somewhere as graphic shapes or not, but some of them have a very interesting meaning here that I have to believe that there was some thought behind it, because if you look, and I'll follow my arrow here, this character here to the left of the dragon is and I'll translate as best as I can. There's sometimes Chinese characters, there aren't the English words to translate it as cleanly, but it's a formal address. This word is how you formally address a woman. The character here is representing day. This is the symbol for the character for west, as east-west. This on the upper right is actually the character for tiger. So, which also makes its way into many of her paintings. This character is old, is what it means. And this is a region in the northern area, a province in China. So I find interesting that these don't read as a sentence, but they certainly seem to have some reference to a lot of the topics that we've been talking about. So very curious here. And the formality of the dragon, with the figure frontal, with the gaze out, a bit of the dragon contours, lines reflected in the floor, I can't help but see that the way she's presented her image here, the formal composition and everything I mentioned about the dragon placement, very synonymous, actually, with the depiction of emperors in ancient imperial court portraits, if we look here, from a portrait from the Ming Dynasty, for example. Look again, the formality, look at the composition, look at the gaze out, customary for a symbol of strength, and surrounded by symbols and vocabulary that describe all the virtues of the subject. Well, look at the dragon motifs. Look at the dragon motifs on the ground below the feet too. I mean, I can't help but see a relationship here of what she was looking at. And so I feel that in returning to The Bride from 1970, which is the first image I started with, I can't help but see definitely an embrace of other cultures and iconography of other cultures and ways of thought from other cultures that really become ingredients in her architecture. And seeing this in a trio, for example, from 3 different somewhat periods, I call it kind of the 3 spirits of Joan. What I feel she's doing with her portraiture is building her own self-image on her own terms, unapologetically. I think that that is an important distinction with Joan. It wasn't just a depiction of the depiction of the self was not a mere representation of her image. It was more that she was building and creating the image of how she saw herself or like to be seen in the larger context of the world. And she created a world all unto herself where she was the center of it. But it was not a center necessarily that everything revolved around her. It was Joan at the center, and she was traveling to all that was around her, is how I view Joan. And so I leave you with this image, this trio, and with the thoughts that I shared with you. And as a footnote, in terms of coming full circle, everything that I was fearful of and running away from when I was a teen, forget it, because Joan embraced it all. And if I could have to say if there was one thing I've learned from Joan, was that you embrace it all there, and what you're looking for could be just right there in front of you, actually.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Francis. And you have embraced it all. And what a fascinating presentation. I know I've learned more about Joan Brown. So I could say you definitely dazzled us with your presentation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
So we're going to go right into a few questions. I'm going to introduce you to Jamie Austin, and she will moderate the Q&A part of the program and start off with a question.
Thank you, Robin. And thank you, Francis, for such an amazing presentation. I really loved your connections to Joan Brown's work with architecture, to looking at Chinese paintings and from an Eastern perspective. And I really learned a lot. So thank you. I will start with one question. And because we have rather a large group today, if you're interested in asking a question, we can definitely fit a few more in. Maybe just put in the chat that you have a question. You don't need to type it out, but just let me know. And then that way I can call on you, and then you can unmute yourself and ask your question in person. But I'll kick things off for us. And Francis, I guess my question, as you know, the sponsor of this event is a group dedicated to supporting women artists. And I noticed from your presentation that Joan really seemed to regard herself as an artist, not just like a woman artist, but was also largely surrounded by other male artists, influenced by de Kooning, and, credits other male artists and teachers as her greatest influences. And so I'm just curious, is there a living female artist today who you think Joan would admire?
A good question. I probably have, living. Okay, so that cuts that one out. I have to put some thought into that one, actually. Let me think.
We can take living off of there if you have someone in mind. I think that's okay if they're not living. Okay,
because I thought of one because it came up in our conversations back then, actually. And that is Louise Nevelson. And it was interesting because in dealing with the architectural motif of the totem sculptures that she did later in her life. And we were talking about what Louise did in the late 50s and 60s also. And I feel a lot of, with much years now of reflection in some of those conversations with Joan, I feel there's a bit of a parallel between Joan and Louise, and they were trailblazers. They were risk takers because they weren't, they did not adhere to conventions. and they were willing to venture into new territory in terms of material and iconography. And they weren't so, you know, and I know this about Joan, is that she, you know, was not concerned about, that was not her priority in terms of what was commercially viable for her. It was, she had a higher calling. And I feel like when you look back at history of artists, the ones that I tend to gravitate towards are the ones that really took made bold efforts to risk it all. And you may not even have a viable career if you didn't adhere to certain conventions. But you know what? They weren't going for that. They were going for a certain personal, as I mentioned in the talk, a personal maturity, for example. And I remember at that time, I had not seen much as a teen of Nevelson's work, but I remember, I think one time, either she brought a book or someone else brought a book in, and that was the first time I think I remember seeing some of the iconography of the standing totems that later I felt you know, had a connection with what she was doing in architecture, in architectural form later.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I see that Catherine Vetney has a question. Catherine, do you want to unmute yourself and ask it?
Sure. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. Joan Brown is one of my all-time favorite artists. So I really loved seeing all of this. You mentioned that there's a lot of important discourse around line in Chinese painting. And I was just wondering where we might go to read some of that or learn more about it.
Oh, good question. You know, it's interesting because it's a little bit of a challenge, because like the artists that I brought up, like Chai Bak-siak, you would need to find books that perhaps are translated perhaps. And a lot of these books are published as more visual books and are not necessarily scholarly, for example. But I think if there are number of books that I've come across in my father's library that talks about calligraphy, I think that's probably the area of search you should go into, because even though in the West, we see calligraphy as a separate category from painting, but they were synonymous because they often appeared in one. There's always a calligraphic inscription by the artist or not, or by a fellow poet, for example, and it's in the painting with the visual. So I think books on Chinese calligraphy, I think you would probably find a lot of scholarship on line and how that is viewed.
I think we have time for one more question. I see one from Kelly Purcell.
Hi, Francis.
Hi, Kelly.
I wondered if you had any of your own work from that time still in existence, of when you were talking.
Oh, another good question. I do, because I am an archivist and I kept everything. And so I had to dust it out of my basement storage. And actually it was in preparation for this talk that I felt like, oh, I want to go down memory lane and just look at some of those images. I have to be honest with you. I flipped open and I couldn't go very far.
Oh.
I was not pleased. And but you know what? It was because I had not opened those portfolio files for like basically 30 plus years. So it was a very good exercise. And for a larger discussion, it's very interesting, because you know what? My eyes have changed. My eyes have changed and hopefully have matured through these decades. And so what I recall, what I did back then is not necessarily the reality. And so it was very jarring and jolting, and it was a lot more naive than I had remembered. So I did. And unfortunately, none of you are going to see it.
Okay. That was my next question.
Okay.
Thank you, Kelly, for that question. And I know we are at time, so I think I'll pass this back over to Robin and Lorna, and we will be able to share a recording of this event if anyone wants to go back and reference any of the images and all of the great material that Frances shared with us today.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining this event. And more importantly, a huge thank you to you, Frances. It was fabulous.
I enjoyed it and loved it, so I hope you all did too.
And I'd like to thank Director Susan Fisher-Sterling. I'm not sure if she's still on this call of NMWA DC, and for all the guests from the surrounding Bay Area museums who are here today. And as Jamie had mentioned, this Zoom call has been recorded, and I'll email it to our members. And I have to also thank you to Lorna Meyer. Our organization wouldn't be here today without our fearless leader. And to all of our members, we thank you for your continued support of our group, and more importantly, for supporting emerging women artists in the Bay Area. So everyone have a wonderful evening. And again, Frances, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Robin, I'll just reiterate, and I want to thank you very, very much, and thank Frances. And Susan, if you're here, say hello and wave. And it's been a wonderful, wonderful event.
Thanks, Lorna. I think I sent a thank you to Frances for what was a really wonderful talk that took me in a different direction in terms of my thinking about Joan Brown. So I really, really appreciate that. That was the best.
Thank you.
I love these because I did our NMWA budget today, Frances, and I also worked on some announcement press releases and things. So it's lovely at the end of the day to end with really great women artists and
Thank you.
an interpretation that I hadn't heard before. So thank
you, Susan. Since everybody's here, I'll just share a final thought, and it's just like, I think, one of the biggest thing about Joan is looking, and she was a consummate observer of everything, every detail. There was nothing that she shied away from. And it sounds very simple, but I do believe that everyone has to work on that, because I feel that people come always to the table, so to speak, with a lot of preconceptions and their own prejudices and their own biases. And sometimes to see something new and different, you kind of have to, I always joke about it. I said, instead of having the umbrella stand outside your door, you have to have a vessel there for people to put all their preconceptions in the vessel before you enter the room, so that you could possibly see something different. And sometimes I feel that you have to jolt the audience somewhat, because otherwise you can't necessarily break through a certain barrier, So I really wanted to make certain juxtapositions here that I believe probably hasn't been done yet with Joan's work. And I just felt like, as an exercise, if you will, if it was only that, to just reverse the lens, to just have this exercise and this journey, instead of seeing Joan looking outwards, but seeing how much really of her thinking, her way of life, her aesthetic was really governed by so much that she soaked in from around the world. And that's the thing. It almost doesn't just exist within the framework of a painting. It's really, Joan exuded that. And I knew that very early on in knowing her.
Great.
Well, thank you, Frances.
Thank you,
And
everyone.
thank you to everyone. And Robin, you too, Jamie. I guess we're ready to sign off. I hate to end this wonderful program.
Yes, thank you again, everyone.
you.